To many, this story may seem strange, starting in a dark Gothic castle in the dead of night. At that moment, the two main characters had a task to spend their first wedding night together. A guy and a girl named Carl and Isabel have been through a lot to now enjoy each other. So the lady was not even embarrassed by the fact that this night was supposed to be her last because of her beloved's curse. She did not regret dying, since her life would have been spent in a small and boring kingdom anyway. The princess thought sadly that the king saw his children only as instruments of wealth. In the very first life of the heroine, who has been reborn more than once, her father cruelly married her off to an unknown rich man. The king of a small state was ready to sell his children in marriage for any amount of money. In subsequent lives, the girl chose a completely different partner for herself, who turned out to be Carl. But because of the guy's curse, all his previous brides died on their very first wedding night. As a result, 12 graves decorated the territory of Duke Vask and reminded him of his atrocities. The heroine died time and time again in her past lives, so she didn't mind keeping the tombstones company. Miss waited with bated breath for the moment when her life would once again be cruelly cut short. It was impossible to tell from the girl's face that she was worried, because the lady had lived a good life this time. During their communication, Carl became imbued with the princess's character, and therefore did not want anything to happen to her. But the heroine treated her impending death with humor, because she was more afraid of living in captivity. Isabel knew she didn't have much time left, so she wanted to get her thoughts out. The princess was sincerely grateful to this man who treated her well. Any other girl in her place would not have been able to smile so happily at that moment. But the lady chose this path herself, because in her past lives she was constantly dying. Unconsciously to himself, the Duke became attached to this sweet, kind, but strange princess, so he reached out for a kiss that could be her last ever. At that moment, the clock ominously struck the start of the next day, signaling a curse. The boy and the girl immediately felt that the atmosphere between them had changed dramatically. In a panic, Carl hugged Isabel, realizing that he could not save her from himself. His curse killed all the brides time after time, no matter how the guy tried to resist it. The heroine's whole life flashed before her eyes, which she lived with dignity and happiness. The lady had time to have a lot of fun before giving herself into the hands of the damned man. None of them expected that instead of a curse, a magical clock would suddenly appear in the air. Carl had already seen them once, as he wanted to use them for himself, but accidentally lost them. And right now, this magical object was performing its powerful magic for the last time. Isabel watched the bright glow with apprehension, still awaiting her unexpected death. But a few minutes had passed since midnight, and the lady was still perfectly fine. Even the Duke could not have imagined that something would happen that could save the princess's life. Isabel couldn't believe her eyes, as she didn't have the magic to summon the clock. But the only thing that mattered to Carl was that his bride would finally not go to the grave. In his joy, he moved too close to the girl from whom he always kept his distance. This made them both embarrassed, and they jumped away from each other, blushing noticeably. Miss did not blame Vashki for anything, because she could understand why he was experiencing such emotions. She didn't even hope that she would be able to stay alive, although she had indicated this option in the contract. The princess remembered that the Duke was not allowed to love her, so she did not pay attention to her feelings. But the caring actions and facial expressions of the guy prompted the lady to think differently. However, the heroine stubbornly attributed all this to pity for a man who would soon die. Since Miss remained alive, she thought about how she would now live for the rest of her time. This issue needed to be decided jointly, so the lady called Carl. But the girl did not expect that the man would suddenly begin to act contrary to their agreement. Questions were spinning around in Isabel's head at a furious speed, but she couldn't find any answers. The princess could only watch the Duke closely, waiting for his actions. The girl couldn't help but notice that for the first time, Carl behaved so strangely and incomprehensibly. For some reason, Vashki turned red from head to toe, and Isabel couldn't see an explanation for it. On the day when the heroine died in her world, the weather was clear and sunny, but the girl set herself the goal of dying, and therefore jumped into the river without regret. She lost consciousness quite quickly, so she did not notice the magical symbols above her. But the lady could not even imagine that she would eventually be able to open her eyes in an unknown place. This was not part of Mrs. Plans, so at first she was even disappointed by this turn of events. But the magic clock did its job, and now the heroine had no way back. After some time, the girl realized that she had ended up in one of the fairy tales, so she began to live up to it. As much as Isabel didn't want to, she did everything that was required of her according to the plot of the story. But Desire did not live long, because one of the mermaids got angry at her and killed her. Before her death, the heroine again heard the ticking sound of a clock, which accompanied her the first time. So she wasn't very surprised when she woke up in exactly the same place and at the same time. Isabel tried to change her destiny, so she did everything opposite to the plot. But because of her escape, everyone's favorite Prince Navontaire quickly died, because no one saved him on the beach. For this reason, the princess was found, and she died again after the same amount of time. Gradually, Desire began to get angry because she could not change her fate. She looked for different plot options, and even managed to marry the little mermaid and the prince. But the heir once again showed interest in the heroine, who tried to be a secondary character. The guy cheated on his wife and didn't regret it at all, because he considered her unworthy. Before Isabel could do anything, the little mermaid killed her in revenge. So Desire almost screamed with anger when she opened her eyes again in the familiar sandy place. But time was rewound, so the girl had to try to survive in this world again. As usual, the prince lay half dead next to the princess and barely breathed. To avoid being burned for treason, as in one of her lives, the lady saved this unpleasant man. But Isabel couldn't hold back and did it in a furious and ruthless way. When the boy suddenly opened his eyes, the mist lied that the sea mermaid was responsible for his salvation. Desire hoped that this deception would be enough to escape from the prince. She was angered by the fact that the guy didn't believe until the very end that he was saved by a sea creature. Isabel ran into the sea and tried to find the red-haired bride of the impudent heir. Navontaire gallantly did not allow the princess to get wet. After all, she had just saved his life. Instead of gratitude, the heroine began to panic and think about how she could avoid another death. She couldn't just throw the prince out of her father's territory, who loved the rich. So Miss simply ran away, which only attracted Navontaire to her personality even more. Now Isabel had to deal with problems that weren't her fault. But Desire was sure that she could handle everything, because she really wanted to survive. The girl didn't even have time to look around when she suddenly noticed another person in the room. It turned out to be her own sister Mary, whom the king had already sold to a profitable suitor. The heroine was not happy about this meeting, since she had not yet managed to remember the characters from the book. It seemed like this girl had always treated her younger sister well, so there was no danger. Quite a long time ago, the king sold this woman to a foreign suitor, so they did not see each other often. Although their kingdom was small, the princess's father managed to remain famous. But these were not his merits, but those of the magic tower that was located in the kingdom. And for some reason, the children of the Desire family were born very beautiful, which allowed them to be sold. The heroine was disgusted by such a greedy father, so she wanted to run away as soon as possible. In the meantime, Isabel was under the care of her confident and independent older sister. The woman had already made sure that the younger one could leave with the groom at any moment. But the princess didn't remember which partner Mary was talking about. She only now realized that Isabel had gone through the trouble of throwing herself into the sea because of her impending marriage. This circumstance frightened the lady, who would like a calm and happy life for herself. The girl carefully tried to find out from her sister who her intended groom was. Desire was relieved to see that there was no suspicion or contempt on the elder's face, but she herself could not contain her emotions when she heard about 40-year-old Dantor. The whole point was that they didn't want to sell the princess to the duke, who was under a curse. Mary had not heard anything good about the seemingly enviable and promising groom. She only knew that her adult son worked for this man and earned good money. The heroine wondered what options she had to avoid death. She didn't want to go through the same story again, where she would encounter the evil mermaid. But the girl also didn't feel like marrying an old man, as the eldest did. The woman complained a lot about having to perform all of her husband's duties. The lady was surprised when she heard that unpleasant rumors were being spread about her sister. The woman herself was sure that her son, with whom she had a strained relationship, was behind this. The heroine did not expect that the guy's name referred him to a completely different fairy tale, not connected with the Little Mermaid. But the lady saw her chance in this, so she decided to talk to him as soon as possible. The mother herself did not really know where the disobedient child, who had long since become an adult, had gone. At that moment, the girls heard the voice of the enraged king, who was dissatisfied with his youngest daughter. Isabel immediately realized that her father's aggression was somehow directed specifically at her. Although Mary had nothing to do with this matter, she was no less frightened than her sister. Desire didn't even try to dodge the hard slap her father gave her in a fit of emotion. The girl was able to pull herself together and laughed in her parents' face, because she wanted to tease him. In such a state, it was useless to talk to the man about serious topics. He was unhappy that Isabel had been absent all night again and suspected her of infidelity. But a good reputation was the last thing that worried the heroine in this life. She had never spoken out so openly against her father before, so he was in complete shock. The king became increasingly angry in his attempts to find a way to deal with his insolent daughter. No matter how hard Mary tried to resolve the conflict, she was unable to calm the king. Isabel openly took advantage of the fact that her father needed to sell her safe and sound. The lady has already come up with a plan according to which she will ask Duke Vask for her hand. This circumstance surprised the king, who had completely different plans for his youngest daughter. But Isabel managed to ensure that her father no longer dared to raise his hands. From the expression on the man's face, the girl guessed that he was beside himself with rage. However, the king did not dare to hit his daughter again, so as not to ruin her face even more. At this time, that same son of Mary, named Snow White, was walking around the castle grounds. He had a very important task from the Duke, but the guy was never able to complete it. The guy didn't come up with any backup plan in case he failed the mission. And at that moment, Isabel appeared in front of him, wanting to talk to this man. Snow White was not delighted with such company, because he had heard a lot of bad things about the lady. However, the assistant smiled delicately at the girl, since he had no right to be rude to her. Desire immediately began to talk about how she had several requests, although Snow tried to escape. The heroine specifically interested Mary's son by knowing the location of Navanter. As the girl expected, this information made Snow stay next to her and listen, so she quickly demanded that the guy arrange a meeting for her with his boss. While Navanter was somewhere nearby, Isabel constantly felt some kind of unpleasant tension, so Desire brazenly joined Snow's walk, who had his own business to attend to. Mary's son was bound by the need to treat all members of his family well, so he sighed and picked up the girl to lead her to the Duke, who was sailing up. But this idea turned out to be not as good for the heroine as she initially thought. Snow White didn't think about his companion's condition at all, as he even walked at his usual pace. As a result, the girl sat down near the first wildflowers to catch her breath a little. At that moment, the idea came to her mind to give one of them to the Duke during the proposal. The guy still considered his relative crazy, but did not comment on her behavior in any way. He had his free time scheduled by the hour, so he didn't give the lady much time to rest. Charles periodically visited neighboring kingdoms in order to maintain relations with them, but the man didn't expect that this time the princess herself would be waiting for him at the pier. Recently, due to his curse, Vashki has been avoiding communication with any girls, so he looked suspiciously at the flower that the unfamiliar lady handed him. Isabel did not waste any time and immediately asked for the hand and heart of the damned Duke. For a while after the princess's words, there was an awkward silence in the air. Instead of answering the proposal, the Duke noticed that for some reason, Desire was barefoot. So, despite all the heroine's objections, he ordered that she be given shoes. Isabel didn't like the fact that the man was rude and bossy in his communication with her, so Miss started to act up and demanded that Carl put her shoes on. Vashke had already regretted several times that he had chosen this particular day to come. For the first time in his life, he encountered such a demanding and impudent princess. However, Carl fulfilled all her requests and offered to talk about the wedding in his office. Isabel also set Snow up by scolding his manners, which almost made the boy go gray. But the Duke guessed that the lady was being capricious on purpose, so he did not pay attention to her words. Even in the office, Isabel continued to behave in an overly self-confident and impudent manner. The heroine clung with all her might to her only opportunity to leave her state, and Carl could not find words because of the girl's sudden proposal of marriage. He didn't believe that this lady was seriously going to die because of his terrible curse, but Desire could not voice all her plans to this man, whom she saw for the first time in her life. Until the very end, Vashti convinced Miss that she would definitely die soon with him, but the girl was not frightened by these words, because it was not the first time she had died within 3 months. Isabel honestly admitted that death awaited her, but the Duke was not impressed by these words. Then the heroine changed tactics and started talking about Karl's 12 dead brides. The Miss was well aware that the guy continued to take brides, so she had a chance. The Duke really couldn't refuse such a lucrative marriage offer. And the heroine, with a smile, asked for just a beautiful death for herself, since it could not be avoided. Even the most tolerant person in the entire empire would hardly be able to understand the thoughts of this lady. So she shocked the poor Duke more and more with her attitude towards death. The man honestly admitted that he did not see any benefit for the girl in this marriage. But this did not stop Isabel from her crazy plans for the rich Duke. The lady was genuinely amused by the fact that Karl turned out to be a rather indecisive person. In fact, the girl was afraid that her father might sell her to Nivontaire in the near future. It was only for this reason that the heroine so brazenly demanded that the Duke make a decision immediately. Isabel resorted to various methods, just to hear an affirmative answer. Miss saw that the Duke was gradually beginning to succumb to her charm and beauty, so she was not embarrassed by the fact that she was behaving in a way that was completely unbecoming of a princess. The heroine eagerly awaited an answer from Vashti, not wanting to accept a refusal. But in the end, the guy made Desar's daughter happy by accepting the wedding proposal. However, as soon as the lady left the door, the Duke began to sort things out with his assistant about her. Snow was not surprised by such emotions from the gentleman whom he had accidentally set up recently. But the guy didn't expect that, because of this, he would have to dodge Vashka's blows. Never before had Mary's son had to fear so much for the safety of his body. Karl himself understood that he had gone too far, but he could not contain his emotions because of the upcoming marriage. Snow White reminded the gentleman that no one had agreed to marry him for a long time. The Duke's reputation for 12 dead brides scared everyone away from his wealth. But the man kept trying to find himself a wife, since only she could save him from the werewolf curse. Not long ago, a fair-haired boy found a prophecy from the master that he would be able to be saved. But Vashti himself gradually began to get tired of the endless victims on his account. Snow's job was to support his master in everything, so he tried to comfort him. But right now, the Duke's thoughts were occupied with the energetic princess who had given him the flower. He had never met a girl before who would so happily agree to die. Even Snow White didn't expect that Karl would eventually take action to get closer to Miss. Moreover, for some reason, Vashti asked his assistant to take care of the flower he had given him. Such actions of the gentleman made the guy interested in his crazy relative. Never before had he seen Karl so moved by the prospect of marriage. Meanwhile, the king was already communicating with the prince who had visited his modest possessions. However, Nivontaire did not just come to visit the ruler, because he had questions for him. The man had never helped aristocrats search for people before, so he became interested. And the guy described to him a girl whose beauty and elegance struck him to the depths of his soul. He was sure that this lady also had a wonderful character, although he had not communicated with her. The king immediately recognized in Nivantaire's words his youngest daughter, who had been behaving madly. He was so surprised that he could not contain his emotions, which caused the prince to notice the king's excitement. The ruler hoped that the miss had not spoiled his plans for selling her with her bad behavior. And it turned out that Nivontaire, on the contrary, was full of enthusiasm to find her in order to take her as his wife. This made the king understand that he could gain a lot from such a deal. But he didn't have time to tell the prince anything, because Isabel demanded a visit. What alarmed the ruler most was that the girl brought Duke Vashti with her. Snow White was the only one who was happy to see Nivontaire, because he was the one he was looking for. The prince himself only pretended to be glad to meet his old comrade, with whom he competed in status. Karl tried to behave delicately with the man with whom he had a strained relationship. Isabel tried not to pay attention to the prince, because of whom she died many times. But Nivontaire had already chosen her as his target and was not going to give up so easily. So the lady had no choice but to politely pay her respects to him. The guy laughed when he saw how well the girl behaved in front of other people. Isabel hoped that her rescue of the prince would not come up in this conversation, but the king remembered it. So the princess had to explain again that she had nothing to do with this matter. It was completely unprofitable for her to become the savior of such a terrible prince. Karl guessed that Isabel was in an awkward position, which made him laugh. And the king firmly stated that he was not going to give his consent to his daughter's marriage to the duke. But the heroine did not plan to give up so easily, as she was determined to fight for her life. The girl's arguments were so good that the father gritted his teeth in anger. But the duke and prince did not give him the opportunity to emotionally harm his own daughter. Vashti was the first to speak, as he wanted to help the lady out of this difficult situation. He immediately told her point blank that he agreed to take this crazy and beautiful miss as his wife. The guy had prepared in advance, and now called his assistant with an incomprehensible suitcase. It turned out that all this time there had been a huge bouquet of elegant roses in this object. While everyone was stunned, Karl knelt down in front of the girl and proposed to her. The heroine looked at the duke in surprise, as he was able to exceed all her expectations for this day. She liked this guy a little more, who was famous for his beauty despite the curse. Isabel couldn't refuse, because she used every opportunity to escape from home. She was even a little embarrassed that such an attractive man had knelt down in front of her. But Desire didn't expect that during the confession, the duke would repeat all her words. At the end of his speech, the heroine was still grateful to Vashka for his agreement to be with her. So she accepted the bouquet of flowers with a gentle smile, along with the prospect of further marriage. But in fact, the lady was confused because the duke was now laughing at her. However, the prospect of a cunning husband was much better than a quick death. The most difficult thing for the heroine was getting the consent of her father, who wanted to sell her to another. To her surprise, the king immediately approved all the wishes of the young couple, but the miss did not relax yet. She was absorbed in the beautiful moment of recognition and was enjoying the bouquet of flowers to the fullest. The king was being disingenuous when he congratulated his daughter on her wedding, as he hoped that she would return home. And then the man could calmly sell the girl to the next rich aristocrat. That same evening, other interesting events took place on the seashore, which few people knew about. A little helper named Dodo was looking for the owner of the magic tower with all his might, but Jamin had other plans for the night, so he had no intention of returning to the office. The servant could not understand why his master so brazenly neglected his duties, and the guy became interested in the surrounding atmosphere because there were particles of magic in it. He found red shoes on the shore, which seemed to him to be an important clue to solving the case. The assistant misunderstood Jamin and began to throw a tantrum. In the end, the gentleman nervously threw them into the dodo and asked to take them to the lab for study. The servant looked absent-mindedly and plaintively after the magician, who quite often did not pay attention to him. In fact, he performed a feat when he went after his master alone, because he was afraid of the dark. And the next morning, Badel was horrified that the princess was leaving for the damned duke. But the girl was not going to change her decision, despite all the possible difficulties. The heroine realized with surprise that she did not have many things for such a status. So the girl even regretted those red shoes that she left on the seashore yesterday. In fact, the lady would like to return to her real world, because this one frightened her. But Isabel knew that this was impossible, since in her stupidity she had died in it. Suddenly, a red-haired mermaid slowly emerged from the water, piercing the girl with a furious gaze. Desire felt uneasy from such an unexpected surprise, threatening her with imminent death. Hoping that she was just imagining things, the girl called the maid to the window. And for some reason, the assistant was never able to see the sea creature peeking out of the water. The heroine could not calm down because of the panic that had gripped her over this terrible matter. She begged the maid to confirm that a mermaid had indeed appeared from the water. But the girl didn't expect that Badel would decide that the princess could see ghosts. The fact that the sea lady once again harbored a grudge against her seriously worried the heroine. But right now, she was faced with the task of packing her things to go live with the duke. In her past lives, the lady didn't even have time to enter the room, as the prince took her away. So until now, it was unclear to the heroine who Isabel really was in this story. The current princess could do little for the already dead, but she tried to stay alive herself. Meanwhile, the duke's huge and majestic mansion was already awaiting a new bride. Desire was genuinely amazed by the scale of the place in which she would now have to live. Charles was so rich that his castle had servants for almost every occasion. But this time, the princess was accompanied by the energetic Snow White, who coped with the tasks perfectly. The lady immediately noted that the atmosphere around was much better than in her previous home. The only thing that bothered her was the strange noise in her head, like someone's voice. But Badel had not heard anything like that, and only urged the princess, who was slowing down. The maid was much more worried about the fact that Snow White had led them away from the castle for some reason. The guy proudly declared that there was only one place in this territory where a lady could be safe. It turned out that he meant the tall tower, standing at the farthest distance from the main entrance. Isabel had nothing against such a place, which was better than her previous possessions, but she didn't expect that it would be Badal who would suddenly start swearing because of the alleged bad treatment. The lady had no desire to enter into an argument, so she stood silently to the side. Personally, the girl preferred to spend as much time as possible usefully for herself. Snow explained too late that the Duke turns into a beast at night and can only get into the tower. But the heroine became angry when she realized that all the dead brides lived in the same place. She was afraid that she might actually see a ghost, something she was not at all prepared for. However, at the sight of the luxurious furnishings of the rooms, the lady forgot all her grumblings and nagging. Miss went to meet the Duke, although she didn't care about any of his proposals. The girl would like nothing more than to spend as much money as possible before she dies. Even Carl was surprised by the greed of the princess, whom he had already provided for so much. The princess hoped to get on her groom's nerves, but the guy quickly agreed to her demands. She never thought that a man would calmly allocate such a large sum of money for her. Isabel was embarrassed by her partner's solicitude, who anticipated her every need. At the same time, the Duke himself asked only that the girl not run away from him before the wedding. This circumstance surprised the lady, who believed that Carl would be more demanding, so she dared to ask the guy not to fall in love with her, because it could bring problems. It's all because, due to the problems from the prince in her past life, Miss had a bad attitude towards relationships. The heroine did not know for sure whether she would be able to survive after her first wedding night with the Duke. But for the contract to be complete, she also needed to consider this important issue. So Isabel asked for complete freedom of action if she survived. That night, not all the inhabitants of the empire were able to sleep soundly and peacefully. Prince Navanter also could not sleep, as he was unhappy with the current situation. The guy couldn't get the beautiful princess who ran away to the Duke out of his head. He remembered with hatred the moment when the girl gave her consent to Karl's proposal. This was not the first time that Vashki had easily ruined the plans of his unofficial rival. So the rage inside the prince boiled more and more, and could not find an outlet. Only an aristocrat named Pluta Hamel dared to disturb his solitude. The girl had feelings for the prince, but as usual, he didn't even pay attention to her. Finally, the ruler angrily called his assistant to take the lady with him. Pluta was ready to do anything, just to stay close to her beloved, who was cold towards her. But the prince only became more angry when the miss suggested that she dye her hair. The only thing that consoled the guy was an incident during one of the events. Then he hatched a cunning plan to kill his own brother, but Vashki accidentally prevented it. However, as a result, the elder was in a coma, and Navanter was constantly pleased by his appearance. Before leaving, he gave Hamel the order to find out as much information as possible about Princess Desar. Pride did not allow the heir to come to terms with yet another and such an offensive loss, and the heroine herself did not even suspect that she had not managed to avoid the prince's interest. As usual in the mornings, the Duke's mighty frigate cut through the sea waves and watched the surrounding area. The man expected that the lady would have time to take a walk by the time he returned from sailing, but it turned out that the princess did not even leave the tower, which was beyond Vashka's expectations. The whole point was that the girl couldn't bring herself to leave the comfortable bed. In her past lives, Isabel had never slept on anything so comfortable and cozy. What impressed the girl most was the stunning view outside the window, which she couldn't tear herself away from. But for some reason, the little mermaid was still swimming near the tower of the escaped princess. Desar could not find an answer to the question of what interested the girl so much in the prince, but she liked to spend her days so peacefully, even if they were her last. The lady had long ago guessed that she had somehow miraculously ended up in a fairy tale world. She was lost in her dreams and did not immediately notice that Badel was again combing her hair poorly. The princess tried to be polite to everyone around her in case she needed their help. However, to the poor maid, she still seemed like a threatening and arrogant girl. Lately, Dazar hadn't said a single bad word to anyone, which made her bored. This is because during her last rebirth, she heard only one ticking of the clock. The girl wondered if this meant that she would no longer have the opportunity to be resurrected. A good massage after lunch helped the princess forget about all her problems for a while. Only this time, the assistant allowed herself to notice that the lady had gained a little weight. The maid realized her mistake after the words had already escaped her mouth. The masseuse was better than anyone else in being able to assess the condition of the mistress's body at a glance. However, before this, the girl had not allowed herself to make any statements about aristocrats. Isabel couldn't just let go of an assistant who had accidentally crossed the line. But at that moment, the Duke unexpectedly asked permission to visit his future wife. This was very inopportune, since the princess had given all her clothes to the wash. So the boys heard a loud noise coming from behind the doors of an angry Isabel. Snow White was the first to rush into the room in panic, fearing for Dazar's safety. The men realized what had happened a few seconds later, causing both to become noticeably embarrassed. The heroine didn't have time to correct the fact that she was naked, so she felt awkward. While the girl stood there in indecision, the Duke sent the upset servant away. First, Carl wanted to hear the princess's version of what had just happened to the assistant. Isabel remembered with sadness that in her past lives, she had been guilty many times in vain, and each time the girl suffered because of the servant's stupidity, but the evil prince did not believe her. But Vashki seemed smart and attentive, so the lady had a chance to come to an agreement with him. Isabel tried to look as offended as possible by the actions of the disobedient maid, but the girl didn't expect that the Duke would only be interested in her lack of walks from the tower. Miss was completely confused because their conversation took such an unexpected turn for her. The guy even brought back from somewhere one of the books that she asked Badel to take out of the room. The heroine began to defend her literary interests, since from the outside they looked strange. But the Duke insisted that the girl go outside from the tower, although she was fine in the room. In the end, Carl said that tomorrow he would personally accompany his future wife on a walk and show her the surroundings. He himself could not understand why he was so angry at the princess, because she had done nothing wrong. And the heroine, under the influence of her partner's words, got out of the tower right in the middle of the night with the help of a teleportation crystal. She immediately heard suspicious and frightening sounds, but the teleporter needed time to charge. Isabel began to look around warily. Realizing too late that she had acted recklessly, she waited impatiently for the crystal to be fully charged and ready for use. Here, the darkness of the night was dispelled by the dim light of the flashlight of a maid who, for some reason, was walking through the forest at that time. Dazar became interested in the affairs of Badel, who was supposed to be resting at that time, so she followed her. The thing was that the assistant secretly visited her only son every night. The princess carefully hid behind a tree and watched the actions of the maid. She had heard before that Badel had a child, but she had never attached any importance to it. The girl was shocked when she heard that the assistant brought the child magical hair. The lady immediately understood that they were talking about her strands of hair, which Badel had pulled out while combing Miss. The woman knew a spell that would activate the full supply of healing powers in this hair. Isabel had to close her eyes as a blinding flash of light momentarily illuminated the entire area. She knew so little about this world that she didn't even suspect that she herself belonged to one of the fairy tales. Badel helped the lady all her life and hid from her the fact that the girl's body had healing properties. The maid only mentioned once that there were other people who wanted to get their mistress's hair. But then the heroine simply considered those unknown people to be madmen and forgot about this strange story. But now she understood the motives of the people who probably found out about the princess's skills. In fact, the lady was not averse to sharing her hair with the maid if she asked. However, now the heroine was offended by the assistant who had caused her inconvenience and pulled out her hair for so long. Isabel didn't bother to deal with the woman now, because she didn't want to frighten her beloved son unnecessarily. So she returned to the crystal with a heavy heart, not knowing what to do with the lying bottle now. The lady was so upset that she had no strength left for her morning walk with the Duke. But the princess did not have time to return to the tower, because an evil beast appeared next to her with a menacing roar. She immediately recognized the monster as the Duke, since there was a black earring on the werewolf's ear. It was that same cursed mark that the boy couldn't remove, causing him to turn into a monster every night. Isabel found herself in a bad situation because it took time to get to the tower. In a panic, the girl looked around, trying to find at least something that would save her in this situation. As a result, the heroine armed herself with her own slipper in the hope that she would be able to play with the Duke. Miss herself understood how funny she looked from the outside, but she had no other options. To his surprise, the animal immediately became interested in the toy that was spontaneously offered to him. Taking advantage of this, Isabel shouted a command and threw the shoe as far as possible. In a few seconds, the dog disappeared from sight, captivated by such an unusual object for him. The heroine was shaking so much with fear that she could not fully rejoice at the fact that she managed to survive. The next morning, as usual, the Duke did not remember anything that had happened to him during the night. He woke up in his own garden, although he was sure that he had returned to bed before the transformation. But what confused the guy most was the small and rather worn slipper that was lying next to him. This morning, Isabel once again had to endure the pain of Bottle's hair plucking. The girl's patience was running out, as she considered this attitude towards her to be unfair. Therefore, the lady honestly admitted that she had learned about all the woman's tricks for the sake of her son. The maid fell to her knees in complete shock, because she was afraid more than anything that someone would discover her. But the lady did not need the bitter apologies of the assistant, who tried so hard for the sake of her beloved child. A plan had been brewing in Desar's head since the night before, so now she grabbed the hair scissors. The maid's whole body shrank from fear, because she decided that her mistress would attack her. She couldn't even imagine that the heroine had no intention of cruelly punishing her with force. Instead, Miss took the scissors to her hair, which she intended to cut short. She angrily threw most of her hair at the maid's feet, unable to contain her negative emotions. That same night, Isabel fled the tower, realizing that she would not be able to drive Bottle out even after what had happened. The girl's only consolation in the end was the Duke, who was now happily wagging his tail at the sight of her. During the time that the princess lived in the tower, she became accustomed to the unstable behavior of the nocturnal animal. Since Miss wanted to communicate with the werewolf every evening, she slept mostly during the day. But Isabel didn't worry about it, because she was glad that the Duke came to the tower for her sake. A few days ago, the girl was very scared of the beast that persistently barked under the windows of her tower. However, Isabel was now completely accustomed to the Duke's presence and enjoyed playing with him. The princess once heard from Snow White that Carl felt extremely ill after his transformation, so Desar shared her healing blood with the dog, knowing that he would feel much better in the morning. Whatever emotions Vashti expressed in this guise, the princess no longer considered him a wild and terrible beast. The heroine stayed close to the dog, because she still could not forgive herself for the recent scandal. And only next to the beast did the girl feel calmer and happier after the quarrel with Bottle. She had no problem touching the dog, because she was confident that he would not harm her in any way. Only this time, the princess was so tired that she didn't even notice how she fell asleep next to the Duke. Unfortunately for the lady, the guy was the first to open his eyes this morning and was very surprised by what he saw. Isabel snored peacefully in her sleep, not even suspecting what such carelessness due to sleepiness would turn out to be for her. As soon as she finally woke up, the heroine immediately became wary of the situation around her. For some reason, she found herself in a room where almost all the furniture was badly scratched by huge claws. A few seconds later, the girl realized that she was in the Duke's own room. Isabel remembered that she fell asleep right next to the beast, who in the morning became a boy again, and she did not wake up. As soon as the lady turned towards the noise, she was stunned by Carl's stunning body. Vashti looked like he had just stepped off the cover of a magazine, of which there were many in the heroine's world. The guy's open behavior made the lady feel even more awkward. It was clear from the Duke's face how worried he was about what was happening. Isabel was afraid that her partner had decided to rush things and spend their first night together now. But what bothered the lady most was the fact that someone needed to come into their room at that very moment. They turned out to be servants who were simply following their master's orders. But the miss was still worried. She watched her assistants with a stony face, as she was sure that they would now spread rumors. Thoughts of what the servants thought came into Isabel's head, and each one was much worse than the last. But the Duke himself behaved as if nothing had happened, which made the lady feel ashamed of her strange behavior. Desar mentally ordered herself to stop panicking, since it wasn't helping her anyway. Before starting a conversation with the princess, the guy waited until all the maids left his room. The heroine immediately regretted that she was left alone with the Duke, who began to interrogate her about that night. But it never occurred to the girl that Carl would suddenly start blaming himself for causing her harm. Isabel's excuses about just going for a walk seemed extremely strange and stupid in this tense situation. Therefore, it was not surprising that Vashka did not take such words from the young and beautiful princess seriously. The guy was sure that any person would run away in fear at the sight of his terrible appearance at night. But Isabel broke that stereotype with her surprise at why she had to run away. Vashki couldn't find a suitable answer right away, as it was difficult for him to talk about his curse. Since childhood, the boy considered himself a real monster, and the fear in people's eyes only confirmed his thoughts. Vashki could barely force himself to say out loud that at night he turned into a real monster. But the lady had already managed to get to know the obedient beast well, and therefore considered him a dog. The girl got tired quite quickly from the conversation, since she hadn't slept much lately, so she brazenly demanded that the Duke give her the peace and quiet she needed to sleep. For the first time in his life, Carl had encountered such a self-confident lady who knew exactly what she wanted. However, he was not repelled by this side of the princess. On the contrary, it brought a warm smile to Vashka's face. He tenderly covered Isabel, who was already beginning to fall asleep, as he began to like this lady more and more. The next time the girl woke up was because Snow White stubbornly tried to wake her up. But the lady herself was not at all ashamed that she had slept through the whole morning, and even a little bit of lunch. The miss confidently stated that she could not act otherwise, so she was not going to listen to the guy's comments. She even allowed herself to communicate informally with a relative, although no one usually did that. Isabel liked her sister's son's sense of humor, style, and beauty, but she didn't admit it to him. Snow had already grown up to be an arrogant and impudent person, so Miss did not boost his self-esteem. With a sigh, the heroine remembered too late her sister's words about her son chasing after many girls. Isabel didn't like the fact that the guy was now giving her various compliments with a smile on his face, so she glared at the enraged assistant, confident that it would work. And indeed, Snow instantly forgot what he wanted to say, since he did not want to spoil his relationship with the lady. Meanwhile, that same Pluta managed to change her image a little, dyeing her hair a natural color. A small bird landed on the girl's shoulder, and the aristocrat immediately smiled mysteriously because of this situation. The fact is that this magical creature was able to obtain a lot of information about Princess Isabel. Hamel tried incredibly hard for the prince, so she even wanted to know why the girl was laughing. She was proud to be able to attend such an important event as Lady Ron's tea ceremony. For quite some time now, this woman, out of spite, has restricted entry for many people, even among the nobility. But Pluta had proven herself so well that she was given an invitation any day. The girl was not afraid that someone could suspect her of magic, because few among the aristocrats possessed it. But the silly ladies enjoyed the cute little bird that had so amusingly landed on their interlocutor's shoulder. Hamel tried to entertain the ladies around her with interesting stories, so that each of them would like it. Pluta needed all this in order to prove to Prince Nevanter that only she was worthy of him. More than anything in the world, the aristocrat liked to see a smile on the face of the guy her heart fell in love with. So she even forgave the handsome man for the fact that he was so interested in another noble girl. Pluta watched with pleasure how pleased the heir was, because she wanted to receive a reward. The lady began to slowly take off her clothes, hinting at the desired prize. In fact, she found the Pied Piper, who told her an amazing thing about the young princess. Pluta would never have thought that, by coincidence, Isabel had possessed a healing body since childhood. She could see from the man's agitated expression how nervous he was about this information. The Pied Piper knew very well that the magic of Dazar had long been considered to have completely disappeared from the face of the earth. And now Pluta was going to give the prince information in measured doses in order to keep him close. She expected to become a queen in the future, and is always close to the handsome and stupid Nevanter. But the aristocrat didn't expect that the guy would want to leave her alone once again. What hurt the lady most was that the prince expressed a desire to visit the territory of Duke Vask. With a voice trembling with emotion, she immediately began to come up with other entertainment for the prince. But as soon as he looked menacingly at the girl once, she realized that she had lost to this Princess Isabel. Instead of leaving a guy who didn't love her, Miss consoled herself with the thought that she could stay with him. And that night, the heroine once again successfully trained the Duke, who in the morning did not remember anything. Isabel had become so accustomed to playing with him every night that she could no longer give it up. The beast no longer frightened the princess in the least, and she trusted him completely and laughed at his funny antics. To make it easier for the guy after his conversion, the Miss continued to secretly feed him her healing blood. The girl thought sadly that Carl couldn't remain so cute and fluffy during the day. The werewolf had extremely sharp fangs, which the girl easily injured her hand on in order to share blood. The dog whined pitifully each time, feeling sorry for the lady, but obediently drank what she so persistently offered him. This time, the werewolf got so carried away that the Miss could hardly hold back her laughter due to the intense tickling. Isabel had never allowed the dog to be so willful before, so she was surprised. But Miss still couldn't scold the beast, since she had become very sympathetic during their communication. Suddenly, the werewolf's entire body was illuminated by a bright light, which then brought with it smoke that appeared out of nowhere. The heroine covered her eyes from the blinding flash, so she did not immediately understand what had happened. The girl immediately noticed the fading glow near the cursed earring of the Duke, who had once again become human. Isabel was not at all prepared for this turn of events, although Carl had already turned into himself in the middle of the night. The heroine had no idea how to explain to the Duke everything that had happened to him. Suddenly, the guy silently approached the lady, as if he was under some kind of spell. Isabel was glad that Carl not only wasn't angry with her, but was also looking for intimacy. She even reached out to him for a kiss, although she was embarrassed because things were rushed. The princess had long considered herself old enough to allow such things. Besides, Dazar wasn't going to die without experience in intimacy with the opposite sex. But the Miss didn't expect that the Duke would suddenly start growling, as if he were a wild animal. She guessed that the guy still hadn't come to his senses, so he followed his dog instincts. The girl herself constantly allowed the dog to get close to her face, which now played a cruel joke. And literally, a minute later, Carl regained consciousness, which made him instantly angry. He was horrified that the lady was again next to him during his transformation into a beast. It turned out that the heroine didn't even notice how the dog injured her hands during the games. The Miss herself did not attach any significance to these marks, since she did not feel pain. But the monster's fangs were so sharp that they left wounds even with the slightest contact. And the Duke knew very well how dangerous he could be during the night transformation. For this reason, he became incredibly angry at the lady who had shown carelessness. Isabel didn't expect that Vashki would allow himself to snap at her because of the overwhelming emotions. But the girl was mentally strong enough to protect herself in this situation. Vashki calmly listened to the grumbling of the lady, who expressed dissatisfaction with his swearing. The Duke sincerely could not understand why Isabel allowed herself to play with him in a dangerous guise. And the heroine was offended by the fact that the guy didn't even try to understand her feelings at that moment. Dazar's attitude towards Carl changed from time to time, which greatly angered the girl herself. A small but insidious plan of revenge on Vashka for ruining her mood matured in the heroine's head. So she demanded that the guy bring her her hat, which he had ruffled in his animal form. For the lady, it was a small price to pay for sacrificing her sleep every night. The girl loved to relax in the bath, most of all in this place after a hard day. Lately, the lady has not been able to get enough sleep at all due to the change in her bedtime routine. The new maid, who treated her mistress with care, brightened her time at least a little. This time, the assistant told the lady that for some reason, she had found her hat near the door. The Miss, out of spite, asked the Duke to return this thing, although she no longer needed it. All because with Vashka's money, she could have bought many more hats that were much better than this one. But right now, Isabel's only desire was a long-awaited and well-deserved rest. The heroine left all the worries to the maid and closed her eyes to bask in the bath. Miss didn't even suspect that all her assistant's fatigue would be attributed to a possible pregnancy. But the most dangerous thing for the princess was that Snow White always knew about all the gossip in the estate. At the very beginning of his magical path, the boy received a magic mirror from his mentor. As one of the most famous handsome men in the empire, Snow was constantly admiring himself. The mirror could answer simple questions, so it could easily confirm the beauty of the young man. Although the assistant never admitted it to anyone, He had a strong narcissistic streak. This time, the guy was so engrossed in admiring himself that he didn't notice how he contacted his mentor through the mirror. It was the master of the magic tower named Jaemon, who became angry when this happened. Snow White could not remain silent about the fact that the Duke had become suspiciously close to the princess lately. Although the guy himself understood that his words seemed incredible to Vashka due to his detachment, but all the servants around were whispering that something was happening between Isabel and Carl, and this made Snow wonder what goals the current bride was pursuing. Previously, among the girls, Vashki had already had ladies who could not take a step without him, but the guy treated each of them extremely cruelly if he began to suspect them of espionage. However, this time everything was different, because even Carl's curse gradually began to weaken. The assistant vividly described everything that was happening to his mentor, wanting to interest him. Suddenly, Jamin admitted that it seemed like the princess was the one who took the thing they needed. He had already gone through a huge number of options in his head, but had only come to this conclusion. And even a capable assistant could not help the wizard in this complex and confusing matter. Snow White was very scared when he realized that the mentor was going to come to the Empire. After all, the ruling family banned Jaemon from entering because he refused to cooperate with them. Meanwhile, the heroine was delighted that her shopping idea had paid off. Isabel hadn't felt this good in a long time, so she regretted not going for a walk earlier. But at the most inopportune moment, the lady came face to face with the Duke. She was still very angry with him because of their recent conversation, so she didn't even want to see him. So the princess walked past the guy, not at all intending to even say hello to him. Vashke had recently been keeping an eye on the girl, whose wounds were bothering him quite a bit. All the guy's thoughts were occupied by the strange and illogical actions of the bride, who hid in the tower during the day. So he called in his best secret assistant, codenamed Shadow, for help. This man always brilliantly carried out orders of any complexity from a single master, and this time was no exception, since he had found out a lot about the girl in advance. Carl was troubled by the fact that everyone who had previously been close to Isabel was now dead. Shadow was a little late, so he was unable to talk to the rat catcher, who had recently been killed. This circumstance upset Vashki, who had hoped to receive more information. The assistant was ashamed to let the master down, because before he had coped with his job, Carl always took precautions to ensure that nothing would hinder him in the future. Only this time, he did not give Shadow the order to kill this young princess. For some reason, the Duke was interested in giving the lady more time to get to know her better, so he didn't ask her opinion about the fact that he abruptly invited her to go for a walk with him. Carl called a doctor to his room in advance to dispel rumors about the princess's illness, but the lady was not prepared for the fact that she would be carefully examined by an unfamiliar doctor. With his decisive actions, Vashki brushed aside any objections from the confused Isabel. Desar did not have time to react to the events that were happening around her at breakneck speed. She was completely shocked that the Duke was so active in doing something without her permission. But the woman with a medical education turned out to be a pleasant lady, whom the lady was not afraid of. However, the heroine was still terribly unhappy that they invited a doctor to see her for some reason. Vashki did not interfere with the inspection process, as he was absorbed in his own thoughts. He was still trying to find an answer for himself as to why he didn't allow Shadow to get rid of the lady. Meanwhile, Desar tried to get at least some kind of explanation from the guy who was silently watching. She had no idea that creepy images of frightened maids were popping into his head. Carl was tormented by the need to kill the princess right now, and the desire to leave her alive. He had a nagging suspicion that this girl was clearly hiding something important from everyone. But every time he saw Isabel full of life, the Duke was at a loss and could do nothing. The lady was still behaving surprisingly noisily, which was not in keeping with the behavior of a princess. The heroine heard the servants whispering about her pregnancy, but she didn't think the Duke would believe it. She sighed heavily in response when the guy admitted that this was the purpose of the inspection. Isabel never thought that her lax attitude would lead to this. The girl was so furious that she began to shake the stupid Duke violently, but she had nothing to say in response to the fact that there were also wounds on her body from playing with the monster. The guy was sincerely worried that he could cause serious harm to the lady who was acting dangerously, but he didn't expect that Miss would call him a cute and fluffy dog. The heroine had long since perceived the werewolf as a pet, so she was not afraid. But the way Carl thought about himself prevented the girl from avoiding further misunderstandings. Isabel defended her rights so zealously that she ended up greatly embarrassing the imperious duke. Seeing this expression on his face, the lady fell silent in shock, as this was not what she wanted. The heroine blushed in response, hoping that Vashka had at least heard her words. That evening, the unusual events in the duke's life did not end with that conversation with Miss. Snow White came to him with an unexpectedly urgent message from the imperial palace. It was easy to tell from the happy guy that nothing terrible had happened, but Karl himself took with hostility the request of Prince Navanter to hold a banquet in honor of the wedding. Vashka had many reasons not to trust the spoiled heir of a neighboring state, but he could not share his suspicions even with his closest assistant. So, all alone, the boy indulged in memories of his childhood, which calmed him down. He still tenderly kept the only family portrait taken long ago. At that time, young Karl could smile cheerfully, because he did not know about the problems in the future. But now the Duke was restless because of his own curse, his rival and the princess. That night, the heroine was going to sleep soundly in her bed, but her plans were disrupted. After midnight, she was awakened by loud whining that constantly came from the window. Isabel immediately guessed that the Duke had come once again to play with her. And indeed, the dog was impatiently waiting for the lady to finally come down to him. But she didn't want the girl to have any more problems with Karl's human part. However, she was pleased to realize that the werewolf in animal form had become attached to her. Unlike Vashki, this part of him could not understand that Miss would not play with him anymore. No matter how the heroine chased the dog away, he still sat faithfully near the tower, waiting for her. But then the princess waved her hand so hard that she lost her balance and fell down. This accident was so unexpected that the girl did not immediately understand everything. Isabel completely forgot about her own safety, which is why she flew from the tower to the ground. At this moment, the lady was sad to realize that she had once again lived for a very short time. Miss was afraid that the Duke would blame himself for her death if he found the body near the tower. She sincerely felt sorry for this strange guy, already suffering from eternal damnation. But then the dog made a powerful leap and grabbed Isabel right from the ground, saving her from the blow. Due to inertia after the fall, Dizar fell painfully to the ground, but at least she remained alive. The heroine's entire short life in this world flashed before her eyes from the fear she experienced. That's why she didn't immediately notice that the werewolf had accidentally scratched her with his sharp fangs. The dog whined pitifully again, as if realizing the dire situation the lady was in. Everything should have ended well. But suddenly, Isabel felt herself getting sleepy. The last thing Miss saw before losing consciousness was the werewolf's worried look. She was so deeply immersed in the realm of dreams that she didn't even feel how she was transferred to the bed. Karl predictably panicked at the sight of the princess wounded by his dog's fangs. That's why the guy took out his anger on his guest, who was the only one who could save the girl. The heroine was lucky that Jamin arrived a few hours ago and immediately learned about the situation. But right now, Vashke was not happy with the magician's work, since Isabel did not open her eyes. The owner of the magic tower was offended by the fact that his abilities were seriously underestimated. Although in fact, he had long ago realized exactly what had happened to this sleeping beauty. By chance, the Duke's curse entered the princess's body and she could not bear it. Jamin was sure it was because of the bite wound on the injured lady's shoulder. But in his story, the magician did not tell Karl everything, since there were some things he could not explain himself. The thing was that the heroine was not just sleeping, but saw a completely conscious world. The girl came to in a colorful and bright place, where tea was poured on the table in front of her. But what struck Isabel most was the familiar silhouette in front of her. It turned out that the real princess was hiding from everyone in this world after her death. Her intelligent and playful eyes reflected the puzzled face of the girl who had ended up there. The heroine guessed that this arrogant lady was the cause of all her previous reincarnations. But Miss had too little information to understand what was going on at all. Just in case, she asked who was sitting in front of her, which caused displeasure in her interlocutor. The real princess calmly replied that she was the same Isabel who gave her life. The lack of concrete data only made the already nervous heroine even more angry. Fake Isabel was unhappy with the fact that she had died so painfully so many times. The princess behaved surprisingly calmly for someone who didn't know where she was. The heroine could not stand it and demanded that this strange girl return her back immediately. But Miss had completely forgotten that she had died in her world, so she had nowhere to return to. Sad thoughts consumed the mind of the fake Isabel as she realized her situation. But for some reason, the long-haired interlocutor did not at all consider her replacement to be unhappy. The girl confidently reminded that the lady in her body was currently living a good life. The heroine had nothing to say in response, because she was surrounded by pleasant things. This was the confession that Isabel, who had lost her life, had always wanted to hear. She smiled sadly, because she could no longer return to the world that she had left of her own free will. According to the rules of this space, the princess did not have much time to talk. The heroine heard the ticking of the clock and in panic began to shout out the questions that tormented her. She could not understand what kind of fairy tale world she had ended up in after her death. Every day, the girl had more and more options due to new fairy tale heroes. The real princess was surprised by this question, as she did not consider it important. But the current lady madly wanted to play the role she had received according to all the rules. Isabel's serious expression frightened the girl, but she couldn't leave without answers. The real princess with the watch herself considered it absolutely normal that people always ended up dying. Beyond the destructible world, the heroine was able to notice an endless sea, which frightened her. Eventually, the girl opened her eyes in a soft bed, but remembered almost nothing of what had just happened to her. From the state of her body, the lady guessed that she had clearly been without movement for several days. But what frightened the princess most was the Duke, who first began to ask for forgiveness. It turned out that all this time, the guy blamed himself for approaching the princess in his night form. The lady herself did not notice how, either from sleep or from the Duke's words, hot and salty tears began to flow down her cheeks. Thoughts in Mrs. Head jumped from one to another while she tried to tidy herself up. That Isabel with the watch from the dream did not give the heroine any peace, because she seemed very real. The girl was afraid to tell Carl about her dreams, lest he think she was crazy. Instead, Isabel once again began to praise the animal form of the boy who had been cursed since childhood. But during the time that Dazar was unconscious, Vashki had time to think a lot about how much harm he was causing her. Although this was not in Isabel's plans, she silently listened to Carl's proposal to terminate the contract. Right now, this was the only way for the Duke to help the princess stay alive. The heroine was surprised that Carl didn't even consult with her about the decision. It turned out that Vashki had received a letter from a prince whom he considered a more worthy candidate. It was wild for Isabel to hear that Navanter was going to personally congratulate her on her wedding. Like the Duke, the lady guessed that the guy was actually pursuing completely different goals. But the girl couldn't admit that all her previous times with the prince ended badly. Dazar had no illusions about eternal life, so she was prepared for her death. Miss could see from the Duke's face that he had stuck to his opinion and wanted to let her go. Too many problems fell on the heroine at once, so she was completely confused. Bottle, who suddenly appeared after Carl left, did not allow the lady to plunge into thought. The maid immediately began to lament about the terrible wound her mistress had received. The girl couldn't even imagine that she hadn't regained consciousness for 10 days in a row. This made Isabel jump up and tell Vashka everything that was on her mind. Dazar realized that she was worrying too much about her partner's feelings and began to forget about her own. This is all because the upbringing from her past life still left its mark on the girl. Then she reached out with all her might to the man who was her only relative. But the father seemed to hate his daughter because at birth she deprived him of his beloved wife. Although Isabel could not stand on her feet for long, she stubbornly pursued her goal. She spent her entire past life with a man who silently carried out his duties. For this reason, the poor girl was constantly looking for love in other acquaintances. She realized too late that she had placed too much hope in people who were strangers to her. And now the heroine felt stupid because she had started making the same mistakes again. Miss did not like the possibility of dying again in misery, which was what everything was gradually leading to. So she rudely stopped the Duke, who had never heard such an address before. True, Dazar was not immediately able to concentrate on the conversation due to overwhelming fatigue. As the princess expected, Vashke immediately began loudly lecturing her. But the desire to achieve justice was so great in the lady that she endured everything. However, this time, the Miss did not even think of comforting the guy, who was already pitied by many. From her past life, the girl had learned that people who pitied her only caused disgust. so she brazenly laid claim to the partner who could soon become her husband. The fact that Isabel didn't even listen to him was a complete surprise to the guy. After that strange dream, the lady's eyes seemed to open again, and she remembered herself. Therefore, the princess was going to hold on tightly to the Duke as her only chance to live. With a satisfied smile, Dazar left Karl, as she now felt lighter in her soul. And Vashki himself responded to her with only a heavy sigh, because he liked the lady for such a character. Since all the work was taken away from Miss, she happily immersed herself in reading books. But in the middle of the process, she was interrupted by a maid who came running with an important message for her mistress. It turned out that the powerful head of the magic tower himself decided to visit the princess. The girl was upset by this event, as she could not remember this person, and the guy himself clearly felt like he was in control of the situation, since he wasn't worried at all. At the sight of him, the lady remembered something that had never happened to her personally in this world. The heroine tried to behave normally, but at the sound of her voice, the magician suspected something. Jamin guessed that the miss was not who she claimed to be, but did not reveal her. Instead, he first drove away the maid who was against such treatment. But despite all the woman's objections, the guy loudly slammed the door in front of her. Only after this did the magician completely relax, ready to return to a personal conversation. He guessed that the princess definitely remembered him, but for some reason did not admit to anything. But what alarmed the lady most was the information that she had stolen something from this man. Jamin was absolutely certain that the magical watch was in Isabel's possession. Meanwhile, the Duke, with the help of Snow White, was sorting out the estate's business affairs. The assistant hoped that the gentleman would not remember the lost watch, but this did not happen. So the guy had no choice but to pretend that he had forgotten about this thing. A few months ago, Karl found a magical clock that turned back time. They were created a long time ago by a powerful magician named Hook, after whom they were named. Snow sadly realized that the master would not be able to get rid of the curse with their help. However, Jamin never stopped searching for such a rare and complex magical item. The only trace the guy could find was red shoes on the seashore. This situation had been so long ago for Isabel that she did not immediately recognize her own shoes. Even the head of the magic tower took several days to determine the owner. Only now did the heroine remember that on the day of her last rebirth, she left her shoes behind. With the help of the magic of tracking thefts, the guy found not only the shoes, but also their owner. The heroine remembered that she saw some kind of watch in Isabel's hands from an incomprehensible dream, so she obediently admitted that she could have easily taken the thing the magician needed. But the lady didn't expect that, in return, Jamin would return her once-lost shoes. As soon as Miss heard the order to put on her shoes, the spirit of contradiction turned on in her. She was afraid that the magician's smile might be fake and that there might be a spell on the shoes. So the girl confidently refused any suspicious offers from the man. But Jamin was aiming for a different result, so he began to force the lady. And at exactly this inopportune moment, the Duke entered the room, wanting to visit the bride. Karl's face expressed genuine shock, because the guy and the girl were doing something strange. At the sight of the Duke, the magician jumped aside in confusion to divert suspicion from himself. He quickly found a way out and announced that he had brought the princess a gift in the form of red shoes. No matter how angry the princess was at the impudent Jamin, she kept silent this time. As if by chance, the owner of the magic tower said that he was able to find the Duke's watch. He briefly hinted to the gentleman about Isabel, allowing him to figure everything out on his own. The magician was interested in being present at the showdown, but he wanted to live more. Vashki didn't know what to think about the fact that Dazar turned out to be the thief. As usual, the wizard, out of spite, hid a lot of interesting information from the master, but he himself could not contain his anticipation, so much so that he even muttered something out loud. Snow White was immediately interested in this circumstance, which he rarely understood from his mentor, so Jamin periodically scolded his assistant for his poor magical abilities. Although Snow was sincerely worried about the magician, he did not even think about leaving the Empire yet. However, the boy couldn't help but shudder at the mention of the Empress who hated him. This woman had long had her eye on the magician's skills, but he desperately resisted this. Jamin was very lucky with the people around him, who saved him from the influence of the ruler. At this moment, a serious conversation took place between the future husband and wife, Vashka. But the guy no longer knew what to think about the princess and where to start asking questions. He specifically listened to some advice and communication from Snow, but even this did not help. In the end, Carl decided to talk to the lady the way he did best, which was directly. But Isabel was not prepared for the Duke to now ask her about the watch. The girl could not give specific answers, which confused the gloomy Vashki even more. The heroine was afraid that someday the time would come when she would have to explain herself as a real lady. This magical watch gave the girl a lot of opportunities, but also brought a lot of pain. But she could not even imagine that all roads would ultimately lead her to the Duke. The lady, from the moment she entered this world, was still confused and unsure of her role. However, this time, the partner unexpectedly supported the princess, who spoke more and more quietly. It came as a surprise to Isabel that the watch could respond to Vashka's magical energy. But the princess was more embarrassed because Carl had to get closer to her. The Duke himself was embarrassed about this, but the curiosity inside him overpowered everything else. He tenderly took the beautiful lady's hand and asked her to concentrate within herself. Although not the first time, Isabel managed to once again summon that strange world from her dream. Immediately after that, she discovered a bright light in the shape of a clock right in the middle of the room. But for some reason, they were illusory, so the princess couldn't touch them. This interested the girl so much that she forgot about all the manners of aristocrats. As with the Little Mermaid and Badel, Carl could not see the clock that was in front of him. However, he believed the miss in words and transferred even more of his energy, causing pain. But at that moment, the watch suggested that Isabel terminate the contract, so she forgot about everything. Desar was so lost in her thoughts that she momentarily lost touch with reality. The Duke noted with concern that the girl had become worse-looking due to their experiments. But Miss was determined to sort out this incomprehensible and unpleasant situation to the end. So she confidently offered the magic clock to terminate their contract. But instead of a clear answer, the lady heard only a quiet vibration from the magical object. She touched the watch carefully, but even then there was no change. This made Miss even more confused, because she had no other options. As a result, the heroine overdid it so much that she had to restore her strength with food. Isabel had come to her senses a little, but she was still barely able to speak due to extreme fatigue. She guessed that it was the Duke who had ordered so many delicacies for her out of worry, and the maid who helped the lady instead of Badel obediently confirmed this assumption. In fact, the heroine was worried about the absence of the assistant who had been with her all her life, so she felt uncomfortable without the one person associated with stability. Although the new girl was sweet and polite, Miss felt that she was missing something, so Isabel came up with a way to show Badel that she wasn't angry with her. The maid was delighted at the sight of an expensive ring as payment for the errand. The girl's joy played into the princess's hands because she wanted to build good relationships with everyone. Immediately after the meal, Desar had to prepare for the upcoming important banquet at the estate. But as soon as the heroine found out that all this was for Navontaire, she became very angry. However, the girl was unable to disrupt the work of the assistants who were already painting her. So the princess pretended to be good, but she was planning to escape. More than anything in the world, the lady did not want to see the prince, because of whom she died several times. But Isabel couldn't help but notice that the maids had made a real beauty out of her. Desar always knew she had gotten into a beautiful body, but today it was especially noticeable. But the heroine still wanted to allow herself at least one prank today. So she put on the bright red shoes that the cunning wizard had recently returned to her. The girl was given confidence by the fact that the magician had enchanted them to quickly move to the tower. Isabel's last worry was a book with a very strange and vulgar title. The lady would not want anyone to see such a suspicious thing in her hands. And as luck would have it, at that very moment, the Duke appeared on the threshold of the room with a grin. Carl was surprised by his chosen one's literary taste, as he considered it to be in bad taste. No matter what excuses Isabel came up with for herself, it was useless in such cases. In fact, Vashki started talking about the book only because he didn't know where to start. But in the end, Miss had to blush and try to come up with a good argument in her defense. This was the only time Desar picked up a book to find something about fairy tales. However, the lady understood that she had completely disgraced herself in the eyes of her acquaintances. Snow White understood women much better than the Duke, so he decided to give him advice. The guy considered himself a true connoisseur and plunderer of the hearts of noble aristocrats. But all his wisdom only made the situation of the poor princess worse.